Hi, this is Mr. Chandler. This section is on 2.4 sectionalism. This is just a summary, so please go to the other video to watch a more in-depth version. The last section was also on this. We talked about the sectional differences and how they developed during the early colonial period and how that carries over into this time period as well. And a lot of regional pride led to self-interested sectionalism, and then the settlement of the West is going to intensify this sectionalism and is going to actually lead to the Civil War. The North developed very differently from the South, and that goes back to what we studied back in 1.1. It had a lot to do with the geographical region and also because of the people that settled there. It was very influenced by Puritan and Quaker beliefs and had a very diverse population. Remember, they had larger towns and cities because they grew up around the church, and those were commercial centers where they traded. They also had education because they wanted people to be able to read the Bible, and then that also expanded as immigrants moved over and they wanted to assimilate those immigrants. And assimilate means that we want to make them more like the white culture that was already there, the white European culture. Immigrants also came over and got jobs, and they primarily came over because there were jobs in industries and factories. There were very few slaves. Most had already been emancipated. Some of the big political issues were high tariffs. Wanted high tariffs to help protect manufacturing over here. And they were also in favor of a national bank because, again, that would help manufacturing over here. And since there were so many manufacturers in the North, they wanted to protect those manufacturers by putting high tariffs and a national bank. As we move into talking about the South, remember back to 1.1, the reason it developed the way it did was because of the fertile soil. So they had large plantations. The large plantations created a privileged class that dominated society and politics. Only about 3% of Southerners owned slaves, but that 3% really controlled society in the South. They had very few large towns and cities because they really didn't need them because the rivers brought ships close to the fields. Plantations were very self-sufficient and isolated. They didn't need to go into town. The only way you could get an education in the South is if you were wealthy. There was no public education for poor whites, and then teaching slaves was against the law. There were very few immigrants because there were very few jobs for those immigrants, and there was very little land available for immigrants to start farming. There's a large number of slaves, and that meant that they contributed a lot to the Southern culture. And that also had a very unique social structure because of the slaves that were over here. The big political issues in the South was they wanted a low tariff because they got most of their goods from Britain. And since the North wants a high tariff, that it's going to be in conflict. They also want to be able to spread slavery to the territories because they're afraid that if slavery doesn't spread to the territories, then Congress will eventually be made up more of Northerners, and that will cause them to get rid of slavery, and they will lose their peculiar institution. The next major area that we discuss is the West. As people started moving to the West, if they moved from the North to the Northwest, then they reflected the values of New England. If they moved from the South to the Southwest, then that was influenced by the Southern society, and that depended on all where they were from. Manifest Destiny strengthened the strong individualism that arose among those settling in the West. Some of the big political issues for people out west were cheap land, internal improvements being like roads and railroads, and they also want uncontrolled banking, meaning the government doesn't control the banks, doesn't regulate the banks. One particular group to discuss at this time are African Americans. In the North, they started to emancipate their slaves, some right after the Declaration of Independence, others as we move forward in independence. There was still discrimination in the North, however. There was de facto segregation, which means by practice. That'd be the opposite of de jure segregation, which is by law, and it's very widespread. In the South, most were slaves, but not all, and their conditions varied greatly depending on who their slave owners were. Some slave owners were really nice and had great conditions. Other slave owners were awful, and the conditions were terrible. Near the end of this time period, the Great Awakening happens, and that's going to lead to social reform, which is going to, again, further exacerbate or make worse the sectionalism that's happening. For one, there's an abolition movement that starts up, and that causes the South to feel threatened that the North's going to try to abolish slavery at some point, even if that's really not the case and the abolition movement wasn't all that popular in the North. However, it makes the South feel like they have a target on their back and that they have to protect slavery. And so as a result, they try to justify slavery even more because of the abolition movement and say that slavery is good, and they start to make comparisons to slaves in the South and how much better they have it than the free blacks in the North. A women's movement also started. The major part of that was Seneca Falls Convention. And really the major thing that comes out of Seneca Falls is the idea that women want suffrage, or the right to vote. In addition, at Seneca Falls, there are other amendments that are passed where women want to be considered more equal. They want to be able to own property and do things that normal people could do, that normal people have the rights to do. This concludes 2.4. This was just a summary, so if you haven't already, please go and watch the video on 2.4 that was done by the group in class. Thank you. Please go to Edmodo to take the video quiz and turn in the notes guide.